Perfect.
So we are live on YouTube already.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Good. So, well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be with you this afternoon, not physically, but through this Zoom conference. And today we'll spend, let's say, an hour and a half talking about this very important question: the post-COVID economy. Is it to relaunch or to rethink? Very important question. So the program for now will be that we'll have a look at briefly a history of the recent crisis, because especially the 2008 one has a key impact on the one we are entering in right now. So that's an important startup to get to the discussion today. Then we'll see, well, knowing what the past has been, what can we expect for the short or the immediate future and even the present. And very quickly, we'll turn to the role of the public sector, that is the one that should try and rescue the economy. And in that, we'll open a chapter on the central role of central banks. Central banks, in a way, are a quite unknown superhero, but rather not invincible. So we'll have to see how it works and what we can expect from their involvement into this crisis. So that's to begin, and then we'll ask ourselves a question: why moving to Mars would be a failure? Sounds unrelated, but in fact, you'll see that there is an important point there as well. And finally, we'll have a look at tomorrow's economy. Once we are over the big or the peak of the crisis, what can we expect? What should we expect? So, a history of recent crises. The first one that we will look at is the 1973 one, and you can see on the graph here that it had very little impact on the S&P 500, which is the stock index that lists the main or the biggest 500 companies in the United States. Still, the impact on the economy afterwards has been very important. Then we'll have a look at the three bubbles, so the 2001, 2008, and the recently exploded 2020 bubble. Every crisis there, each and every one of these crises will tell us something that is interesting to understand and comprehend what we might expect from the 2020 crisis. So each and every one of them has an element that we will see and that we will follow in 2020. So crises never repeat exactly the same way. I don't remember who, but someone said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes very much. So we'll try and identify the rhymes here to see what we can anticipate for 2020 and beyond. So the first one is the 1973 oil shock. Back then, the OPEC countries, so the countries, the association of countries who produce oil, decided to cut the oil production for geopolitical reasons. They didn't like the fact that the United States sided with Israel in a conflict, so they decided to cut oil in response to that. Back then, oil was already an essential supply to run the economy. So we see in the picture gas shortage, limited sale per customer. That's for cars moving, but the industry was running on oil very heavily as well. And then we had here the perfect example of what we call a supply side crisis. It's an economic crisis that comes from a problem on the supply side. So here we were missing the supply of an essential component, an essential factor in the economy, which is oil, and that created an economic crisis that followed. So supply side crisis is the example of that crisis. Then we had the 2001 dot-com bubble, so years afterwards. We had a few crises in between, namely in 1987, Black Monday on the stock markets, etc., but a bit less interesting for us to understand what's going to happen in 2020. In 2001, so the dot-com bubble burst. Effectively, leading to the beginning of 2001, there was a completely irrational hype about internet startups. Everyone wanted to purchase internet stock, and it was a bit, it was a big madness. And I remember years afterwards when a teacher told me, well, when your cab driver, your bartender, your hairdresser, they all give you stock advice and they all manage to make money on the stock market, then it's the sign that there might be a bubble. So that was very much the case. That's what we had. Everybody was investing, everybody was making money, everything was going up, and it was great. I'm going to tell you two anecdotes that I lived back then, and that kind of exemplify the what this crisis was about. That's what I call the banker and the ant. So the first story is about the banker. I was a student back then in 2001, and I remember during the day going to my economy courses and listening about scarcity. That was the driver of economic growth, and there was a constraint, and etc., etc. And then we tended to see outside the internet just growing with no limit. That the prices went up and up and up. Everything was beautiful and great. It was a new revolution, etc. And in fact, back then it was difficult to see what the internet would really bring. So, okay, sending emails, fine, but billions of dollars for that? Well, not really. There was Amazon, okay, buying books online. There was only books back then, fine. So it was difficult to see the whole hype behind it. And one day, I had the chance to meet a banker that had recently been appointed head of internet in his bank. And I thought, okay, great, I'm going to ask the questions. What are they going to do? I mean, it's very interesting. So I meet this guy, and he says, okay, well, we voted in bank to deploy 1 billion euros into the internet. Great, excellent. So then he went on with, corporate blah, blah about values and etc. Okay, so I politely let him speak about that, and then said, okay, what are you going to invest in? I got a bit more blah, blah into values and future and blah, blah. I said, yeah, sure, but tell me really, what are you going to do? The answer was, we're going to build a website. Okay, $1 billion on the website. It's kind of disproportionate. So let's say 10% of that goes to it. 100 million, that's still crazy, but let's say it's the case. What do you do with the remaining 900 million? And I grilled him for quite a while, and eventually he confessed he had no clue. He had absolutely no clue. Because back then, everyone said, we have to be on the internet. We had no clue, but we had to be on the internet. So we brought in budgets and etc. And this banker, with his 1 billion budget, wanted to build a website and didn't even want to go into online banking because he thought it was too dangerous. So that was really the example of the bubble. You've got all of a sudden money appearing, and that goes into things that make no sense. The story of the ant is a shorter one, and one that exemplifies also the lack of judgment of investors back then. Guy had decided to create a startup consulting company, based on the way the ants work. So there is the queen, there are the workers, there are the fighters, etc. And he wanted to sell consulting to companies about that, probably the ant being the CEO and etc. And so it's just, I mean, you can speak for 10 minutes about that and then it's over, But he managed to raise $4 million on that. So that was a moment when anything seemed to be possible. And we were clearly, and that's in my third point here, into the cycle of greed and fear. Cycle of greed and fear is that when everything goes well, you're greedy, you want more, and you kind of abandon the idea that there might be risks, there might be difficulties, and etc. And then all of a sudden, someone starts feeling fear, and then everybody is panicked, and the stock markets crash. That's this problem that we see very often, or too often in the stock markets, the cycle of greed and fear. During greed, your judgment is obscured, you can't take good decisions, and during fear, it's the same. And you basically, in the first part, buy a lot, and the second part, sell a lot. So when the 9/11 terrorist attacks arrived, that was the end of the game, and the bubble was completely gone. And we saw there coming a demand-side crisis. That's the important point for the 2020 crisis that we will see afterwards. The demand-side crisis is that people stopped spending or spent less than before due to two reasons. The terrorist attacks acted the same way as in a war. And during these times, you tend to be shy, to stay at home, and to think you have to save money because you don't know what the future holds, etc. So you spend less. And also, all the money that was invested in the stock market in the bubble was gone, had been destroyed. So many small investors who had invested sometimes a lot of money got that wiped out. So we had a demand-side crisis because there was not enough demand. So that was it for the 2001 dot-com bubble burst. And now we see the last one before today, the 2008 subprime crisis. I'm sure you have studied that already, you have seen that. You've seen the drawing, so subprime mortgages taking down the mortgage companies, taking down lenders, home builders, market, US economy, and the world economy. To summarize briefly, bad loans, very bad loans, were made to people who could not afford it. So sometimes close to millions of dollars were lent to homeless people to buy very nice houses. And these loans were repackaged in financial instruments through a system that is called securitization, and they were sold worldwide. So the crop basically was taken, put in a bag, shaped properly, and then spread all over the world. When we discovered that these assets were not good, well, the bank balance sheets were loaded with them, and there was a big risk that the bank would go bankrupt. In fact, some of them did. Lehman Brothers, the infamous bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, has happened due to that. And so what happened were losses were suffered all over the world, and there was a systemic risk that was created. What is a systemic risk? It's a risk that the entire system is threatened. And how did that happen? Because of the banks. Because all the banks were threatened to go bust. We had the risk of all the banks going bust then, and the economy not finding proper financing because of lack of banks. And that's where we invented the too big to fail concept. Those banks, or this sector, was too big to fail, and so we had to do everything that was possible to save them. That's what was done. So how was it solved? Banks being too big to fail, they were bailed out with public money. And so, as we see on the cartoon down there, the banks who created the problem at the beginning by repackaging bad assets tried to lend to the economy, but had to obtain the backing of the government for that, and the rescue of the government through the bailout. Bailout simply is money going from the government to the banks, being just almost given to the banks. And effectively, who is the government? Well, the government is just looking after the taxes paid by the taxpayers. So the mess eventually fell back on the shoulders of the taxpayers. So that's what happened in 2008. What did it leave us with? Well, not very positive things. The public deficits have been only very partially covered by taxes, and states had to borrow money, and they are highly indebted. We'll come to that afterwards. You'll see that the main developed economies, the states of the main developed economies, are already quite indebted. And then to support the economy, central banks kept the interest rates low. That's the main medicine we have against economic crisis, lowering the interest rates. Why? Because if you've got a low interest rate, you can borrow money, and by borrowing this money at a cheap rate, then you can afford it. If you have to pay 10% on your loan, it's much more difficult than if you have to pay 0 point something percent. So many companies and people borrowed money. And that had the consequence, which is that it was exactly the opposite of what we had to do, which was deleveraging the system. In 2009, it was said everywhere, we have to remove the leverage in the system, there is too much debt, etc. But by keeping the interest rate low, in fact, we increased the leverage. So what was an absolute priority in 2009 was completely forgotten and became worse. That's the situation we're in today. And to make matters even funnier, to support the economy even further, central banks directly bought bad assets in exchange for fresh cash. We'll see that mechanism a bit later because that's what we will see in 2020 most probably. And that was called the quantitative easing. So once all of that was done, we all hoped everything would go for the best, but that's not necessarily much more than wishful thinking. Now, moving on to the 2020 crisis. We knew it would come. I put you here a slide I presented in one of my classes in February 2018, so more than 2 years ago, where it was visible already that a third bubble was inflating in the US and elsewhere as well, probably. So we knew the crisis was coming and had to come at some point. What we did not know was how it would start, and that's the interesting part. In 2008, I remember reading every day in the papers the hedge funds pose a threat, a systemic threat, etc. And the crisis came from the subprime mortgages, so absolutely not where we thought it would come from. And some hedge funds, the Paulson hedge fund, namely, made fortunes on betting against the subprime. So what was seen as a threat, eventually some of them profited from the crisis. So that was clearly not where it started from. For 2020, well, we were thinking about geopolitics. There was tensions with North Korea, but eventually it happened to disappear. Then there are tensions between US and China with the trade war having a major impact on these two economies and worldwide. But that's not what started it. We thought about cryptocurrencies as well. Bitcoin was clearly in a bubble phase. We saw the whole bubble behavior coming up. So the irrational increase of the value of the Bitcoin, people rushing in to buy it, to give you tips and advice to get into mining Bitcoins and so on, etc. And yeah, it didn't start it either. That was not it. It could have been, but it was not embedded enough into the real economy, and that's not where the problem came from. Shadow banking, well, very big thing. After 2008, banks suffered a lot of major restrictions on the type of assets they could hold. Because of that, there was an entire sector that bloomed completely, and that's the shadow banking sector. So this sector is a bunch of companies. We don't know who they are. We don't know exactly what they do. They are not regulated, and they are lending money to the economy. So they could be insurance companies, they could be startups, they could be private funds. We have no idea. And that for 2020 will remain a big question mark. That's not what started the crisis. That can be an acceleration of it. And then the last point, we thought about an interest rate increase, but it decreased. So eventually there was nothing of what we could anticipate. It was just a very tiny little small virus. And that's what started it. So that being said, what can we expect from now on? Well, keep calm and fasten your seatbelt. And you better get a good seatbelt, not just a simple one you've got in your car, because it's going to be a bumpy road ahead for quite a while. A few months, but probably maybe, unfortunately, a few years. And that's going to be quite turbulent then. What can we expect? Well, we are entering this crisis with an already fragile economy. you see what 2008 left us with, already indebted states and a lot of leverage. I draw your attention on one thing, which is the zombie companies. Some companies today keep working only because they can refinance their debt. They should not be continuing to work. They should have gone bankrupt already, but because it's easy and cheap to get debt, then they continue staying alive. So we call them the zombie companies. The problem there is that the indebtedness level makes a crisis even more lethal for a company. Why? Because if you have more debt, you have more repayments to make. And if your sales decrease or your revenues decrease, then you've got less money to pay the debt. So more debt, less revenue, big problem. If you've got less debt and more other sources of funding in the form of equity, so your shareholders giving you money, then you have a bit more flexibility or room of maneuver to go through the crisis. But there, no, that's not the situation. And corporate debt in most G20 countries is at its all-time highest anyway. So that's a big problem. The European economy was noticeably slowing down already. So in spite of all the help and the usual weapons that we use to counter the crisis, the low interest rates, also buying back assets, etc., the economy was already slowing down. So starting up again will be really difficult. And if we've used all the medical tools, medical economic tools that we have to save the economy, well, how much more can we inject in there? So you see, we're not entering this 2020 crisis in a solid situation. We're in fact already in a quite fragile situation. What are we facing then? We are facing a demand and supply side shock. That's quite unprecedented in recent history. We've got the double shock. You remember 1973, we had the supply side shock, and in the other two crises, we had the demand side shock. But here we've got the two. Why supply side? Because the workforce is locked down. Not anymore in some countries, but then there are the questions of second waves and so on. So production is in trouble. Production being in trouble, then companies cannot work properly and cannot supply what they were supposed, or cannot produce what they were supposed to supply to the market. Add to that the uncertainties about the international supply chains and all of that, then we clearly have a supply side shock. So we've got a big and clear issue there. But we also have a demand side shock. People are locked down at home, and so we don't spend. Even though we would like to, we can't. And even if we are reopening and giving the ability to people to go outside again, not everything is reopened. There is still again the threat of a second wave, and etc. And there is this feeling, a bit like in a war, that tomorrow is going to be difficult and we should save. So we really have these two shocks at the same time. And the only time recently, the only other known situation that led to that recently was World War II, which ended 75 years ago. So it's an unprecedented, what we're living is an unprecedented event in the last 75 years. That's quite a big one. So what do we fear exactly? We fear the recessionary vicious circle. How does that work? We see that people spend less and companies produce less. What does that create? Well, the direct impact of that is that companies sell less. I'm buying less, and anyway, as a customer, and the company anyway produces less, so we can't buy as much as we want, and companies cannot sell as much as they want. So companies have to reduce costs. Among the costs that exist, companies can lay off staff. Laying off staff increases the unemployment rate, and people who are unemployed don't earn money, so they spend less. And we can go in circles like that for quite a while until, well, we don't want to test the bottom of that circle because it would be quite ugly. So what can we do? What can we do? The first and obvious thing would be to restore confidence, because if you create confidence again, people start spending a bit more. Companies start investing and produce more, so companies sell more, and therefore they can hire people, unemployment decreases, and you turn the vicious circle into a virtuous circle. But today, confidence is clearly, unfortunately, not an option. Why? Because we have the threat of the second waves, we have all these geopolitical tensions that remain, we have a president who shall remain unnamed, who advises you to drink chlorine and swallow light bulbs to fight the virus, and all of that basically is not good to create confidence. So exit confidence, that we cannot do. So we are moving towards guerrilla tactics. If we can't break the entire circle, then we should target a few spots. So we are going to look here and there. We are going to make sure people try and spend more and companies try and sell more. How do we do that? Well, very easy. We just give them money, right? Why didn't we think of that before? Just give them money. Sure, that's good. If I've got more money, I'm going to spend more. If I'm a company, I've got more money, I'm going to invest more. So that sounds like a very good solution. But yeah, tiny little question. Where does the money come from? Here we go. Public sector to the rescue. The money will come from the public sector, and namely from the states. In many countries, the states and the governments have decided to help people, help companies as well, to overcome this very special situation. It has been decided to lend money to companies, even to give them money sometimes, and the same to people. So do states have very deep pockets? Well, we've got to get back to the basics here. I see, along with Elon Musk. Yes, good point. Well, we'll talk about him a bit later. So we'll see that. Yes. So do states have deep pockets? Well, not so sure. In fact, the money from the states comes from taxes that we taxpayers and the companies we work with pay. So if we want to give money to people and companies, and the money comes from taxpayers, are we just helping ourselves? In fact, no. In times of crisis, the states spend more than they collect, and they borrow money. So they create indebtedness to have enough money to lend or give it to the people. The issue with that is that we have already quite a high level of indebtedness. We measure the level of indebtedness by calculating the debt, national debt, compared to the GDP, gross domestic product. And here you see that these advanced economies have public debt, for some of them, above 100% of the GDP. It means that they have borrowed money in an amount that is more than what the entire country can produce as a value for the entire year. That's huge. That's already pretty big. And so the definition of the ratio here is debt divided by GDP. Fine. What is going to happen? The debt is going to increase because states borrow to give or lend money, and the GDP is going to decrease because no matter how much money is given, there will be unemployment, there will be failures of companies, etc. So mathematically, this leads to a very big increase of the debt to GDP ratio. So that's the problem we're facing with the public debt. When is it repaid then? If it's increasing, when does it get to be repaid? Well, in fact, in the last 40 years, it doesn't. We just don't repay the debt. If you see the graph on the top left, the level of the indebtedness compared to the GDP has decreased in the United States until 1980, 40 years ago. And since 1980, it has increased. We see that towards the late 90s, the debt to GDP ratio decreases, but then increases again, because the economy was growing very fast at that time. If you look at the graph on the bottom right, in the 90s, the debt in nominal terms was still increasing. So that's a very big issue, because the debt increases and never decreases. And the part that is quite surprising is the right part of the right graph. We had at least 8 years of economic expansion, let's say 2012, 2020. Those years were years of economic expansion in the US, at least, where the stock market went up, the company fundamentals were solid, blah, 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 all of that. And in those years, we see the speed at which the debt, the public debt, has increased in the US. Okay, so that's quite worrying, because it means debt apparently never gets repaid. It's taken on in crisis time and also in good times. So it's just increasing seemingly endlessly. So who is foolish enough to lend to the states? In fact, you and I, without knowing it very often. Why? Because we deposit our money at the bank, and the bank invests our money into various financial securities, including public debt, because the states do generate a lot of debt, and therefore the banks buy them, so fund the public debt. So without knowing it, we do fund the public debt. There's not just us, there are also companies, any institutions, and we have also what we call the institutional investors. So mostly, or in majority, the insurance companies, pension funds, and endowments. But one important lender to the states through the banks is are the central banks. And without the central banks, all that would not hold. Enter the central role of central banks, the very important superheroes. There is a question, yes.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to know, like, in terms of like taking the US, we know that when the economic crisis which is happening right now, the Federal Reserve stepped in to fill up that money, which indirectly added more debt, because US itself is in a 14 trillion debt. So I'd like to know, how does that vicious cycle end, or will it ever end? Because we were talking about the central banks coming in.
That's the whole point, and that's what we're going to see now. Thank you for your question. That's I'm glad you're asking it, because that's what we should all ask ourselves. How do we stop that? How do we stop this indebtedness vicious circle as well? And the answer, as we will see, is not obvious. And I think it's you, David, who spoke about Elon Musk. We'll speak about him, but not necessarily in a positive light, because of this vicious circle thing. So the central role of central banks. Here you see the graph of who are the biggest lender to the states. So I took here the example of the US Treasury, and so all the American public debt. The same would be more or less valid for Bank of Japan, Bank of the European Central Bank, etc. You see that there are a number of institutions that hold the debt, but I've put a black arrow into the blue section there, which is called monetary authorities. In fact, when you look at foreign pensions, mutual funds, etc., they are all groups of investors. So groups of foreign investors, groups of pension funds, etc. But the monetary authorities are mostly the central bank, the Federal Reserve in the United States. So that is we could almost consider it's a single lender there, more or less a single lender that holds all that piece of debt. So that's why they play a very central role in taking on the debt of these of the states. Now, we have the central banks lending the money to the banks, and the banks lending the money to the states by buying their debt, and then the states lending the money to the companies. So if we continue like that, who lends money to the central banks? Because we need to get to the bottom of that. Well, nobody, because central banks actually print money. And the picture you see on the right is effectively dollars, banknotes printed for the benefit of the central bank. When we say print money, there is also the creation of a electronic money. So it's not only banknotes and coins, but we still refer to it as printing money. Now, what will be important to understand here is the mechanism that brings this money that is printed here into the economy, but mostly what the consequences of that are. That's the key part. Are we fine with that or not? For that, we need to start with a tiny little bit of accounting. I'm going to be very quick on accounting. I know people generally don't like that, so I swear I'm going to be fast. Let's compare a normal company and a normal bank. In a company, you've got in the balance sheet the assets. The assets are what the company invested in, so machines, cars, computers, etc. And on the other side, that's how it financed it, so equity and liability. Equity is the money from the shareholders, and then you've got loans and bonds. If you take a normal bank, their assets are, among others, loans to companies, and their liabilities are our deposits, also shareholder money and some borrowings. The link we see here is that the assets of the bank are the liabilities of the company. So that's relatively easy to understand. The company is the same. I could have made the same comment for us as private individuals. If we want to buy a car, for example, then we put some money ourselves, we go to the bank, we get a loan. So the car becomes our assets or our asset, and we've got equity and liabilities. Now that's the balance sheet of a central bank. So that doesn't look at all like like normal banks or like companies or like our own balance sheet. To simplify a bit, let's draw it like that. Okay, we've got assets and liabilities. So assets are the top part of the graph and liabilities the bottom part. And in the assets, you've got fancy names: mortgage-backed securities and treasury notes and bonds. In fact, mortgage-backed securities are loans that banks made to companies and that were repackaged. So that's mortgage-backed securities. So effectively, it's bank debt, and bank debt that goes to the real economy. And treasury notes and bonds are public debt. So central banks in their assets have debt from other public or private institutions. In their liabilities, and that's where it's getting interesting, they have currency and reserves. Currency are for the Federal Reserve, that's the graph of which we have here, are dollars, very simply. And reserves would be dollars. Okay, let's not get into too much or too many complex details, but let's say it could become currency quickly. In theory, there is no upward limit to the balance sheet of a central bank. Why? Because central banks can create currency. They can just create currency the way they want. They can print it, they can write a number in a bank account, and they create currency. And for that, they will obtain in return bank or public debt. So in theory, there are no upward limits. But there is a quote I like when we get to this point, which is, one day I will go live in theory, because in theory, everything will be fine. In theory only. So that's a bit the limit there. There is, in theory, no upward limit. Let's try and see how the trouble flows to the central banks. Okay, that's not a very easy process, but relatively, very important these days. So first, what happens? Banks lend money to companies and to states. So there is money flowing from the assets of the bank to these two group of institutions. When a crisis comes, then public debt increases because it is distributed to companies and people to help them overcome the crisis. So very quickly, here you get in trouble. There is public debt and there is too much public debt. After that, if the economy goes wrong, then these parts, so the liabilities of companies, get in trouble as well. We see that the companies sell less, but they still have loans to repay. If they sell less, they have less ability to repay the loans, so the liabilities get in trouble. Now, if we look at the arrows in the other direction, effectively, what happens is that the assets of the bank get in trouble. And that's the problem, because banks are too big to fail. We've seen that. If we let banks go down, the entire system goes down. So in 2008, the central banks went out of their way, which was generally to set up interest rates at a certain level. And what did they do? Well, they moved the trouble to their balance sheet against cash. Central banks create money in exchange for troubled assets. So they take on the troubled assets, so the debt of public states that are too heavy, the loans from the companies that are in trouble, and in exchange for that, they give cash to the banks. So the banks are happy. You know, they had troubled assets, now they have cash, and as you know, cash is king. So banks are fine. If the cycle turns at some point, which eventually happens, then the companies start doing better. So their liabilities start doing better too. And we end up with that situation. We've moved the trouble to public debt and to central banks. And that's where they stay. That's where they stay. We'll see why afterwards. They don't get reversed, or in the recent past, they haven't. And that's what will pose a threat for 2020. So we might be tempted to think, okay, well, we've isolated the trouble. It's in public debt and it's in central banks. So fine, you know, it's there, but what's the problem with leaving it there? Well, first, let's have a look at the size of the assets of the Federal Reserve since 2006. You see that in 2006, it was a bit less than $1 trillion. And after the 2008 crisis, it increased to a very impressive $4.5 trillion. The black line in between 2018 and 2020 here represents the present time when this graph was made. And what is on the right, called GS baseline, is the estimate by Goldman Sachs of what the evolution of the assets should be. And the central bank, the Federal Reserve, had announced a reduction of its assets. And it started to do so. It did. And it was planned that in 2020, it would resume buying assets, but at a slower pace. Now, what happened for real? Central banks and the Fed first, and well, you know, European Central Bank, the Chinese Central Bank, all of them did the same. They started buying assets again to give money to the banks so that the banks could buy the public debt of the various states and also could be relieved from troubled assets, so troubled loans from companies. Where do we stand now? Did we follow the Goldman Sachs baseline? Well, not at all. You see that we are now, and the information is from the 6th of May, so last Wednesday, The central banks publish their balance sheet every Wednesday, so I couldn't get the data for this Wednesday because it's going to be published probably tomorrow or tonight. But last Wednesday, it had increased to $6.7 trillion. When it was at 4.5, everybody was a bit worried already, and here we are at 6.7 already, and counting. It has not stopped. So in 7 years, the amount of assets on the balance sheet of central banks, or the US central bank, the Fed, has been multiplied by 7, and most of these assets are in trouble. Or, I mean, a big part of it. To understand why it's problematic, we have to see how money works. Before, money was backed by gold. So from 1944 to 1971, we lived in a system that was called Bretton Woods. And it meant that every dollar had a value in gold. And that was 1/35th of an ounce of gold. So it was a tiny little amount of gold, but still, it had a value in gold. And since all the main currencies in the world had a fixed exchange rate to the dollar, indirectly, every currency had a value in gold. So back then, $1 was worth a piece of gold. Good. Today, money is backed by what? 2 things: trust and troubled assets. Well, I mean, it's a bit less shiny than gold, right? So the story was that in 1971, Nixon wanted to have more money available to grow. And so he did start a process that eventually led to the end of the Bretton Woods system. And we entered into a floating rate system. And that's led by demand and supply. If many people want dollar, then the dollar goes up. And if less people want dollar, it goes down. Fine. But then, so what is really the value of a dollar today or a euro? Well, it's backed by 2 things these days: trust that we have in the institutions and troubled assets. Trust is the fact that we are confident the US public sector is solid and competent enough to manage the euro, that the European Central Bank and the Eurozone is solid enough to have properly working institutions. That's one thing. We could debate a lot of that, a bit more political, but I guess that level of trust is probably decreased recently. And then the second thing is troubled assets, because if you remember, on the balance sheet of the central bank, on one side we've got the assets purchased, troubled assets, most of them, and on the other side we've got currency. So today, $1 is equal to the trust we put in Mr. Powell here, the president of the Federal Reserve, plus a bunch of smelly assets. Does not sound really, really nice. So we are entering basically into a territory that I would call economy fiction, like science fiction. We are testing the limits of the system, and by increasing the value of the size of the balance sheets of the countries. How far can that go? We have multiplied the size of the main central banks by 5 in 14 years. At the same time, the world GDP has been multiplied by 2 only. So it seems that we're producing quite a lot of troubled assets to get some good growth. Multiply by 2 the GDP in 14 years is a very good result that we didn't achieve before the beginning of, or before the Industrial Revolution. That's something that never, ever happened. But there is a saying that goes, trees don't grow to the sky. So when does that stop? Especially when we know that a big part of those assets are in trouble. So how long can we pile up crap and create money backed by it until no one trusts the system anymore? How can we reverse this situation? Well, certainly not by moving to Mars. Let's see that. Just before we move to the Mars story, Where do we stand today? That's my estimate, $25.3 trillion last Wednesday. Okay, it's subject to discussions because there are a number of estimates in there, but we are more or less there. So you see as well that when the central banks in the world started selling their assets, so doing the reverse, basically getting money back and putting assets back in the economy, markets hated it absolutely completely. They really didn't like it. So the reverse, and that was the question, how do we reverse that? How do we break the cycle? How do we go down? Well, we've never tested it. Since we started ballooning these central bank balance sheets in 2008, we never tested the reverse and the decrease. The tiny little test we started making created trouble on the markets that were really so strong that central banks had to back down. So how far can that go? Well, certainly not by moving to Mars. So why moving to Mars would be a failure? To answer this question, first, we should ask ourselves, why don't we repay public debt? Why don't we? I mean, it's there. We see it's a problem. Let's repay it. I mean, what are we waiting for? Well, liberal economists will tell us, anyway, debt has a market, and market is the truth. So if markets like debt, then that's fine. We don't have a debt problem. I would be tempted to say that we do. Why? Because this debt is the epitome of what we could call the privatization of profits and socialization of losses. What does that mean? It means that in crisis time, banks mostly asked the states to save them because they were too big to fail. So money went from the public sector to the private sector because we had a systemic issue. However, when the cycle turned, then banks and companies asked for tax cuts to be able to create jobs. And therefore, they did not pay the taxes that normally, according to the high-level Keynesian theory, should fill the public deficits. And we've seen a few slides ago that during this expansion time, in fact, the deficits didn't reduce, they increased, and they increased at an even faster pace than before. So the cycle just doesn't turn, and the money goes always in one direction, from the public to the private sector. You see at the bottom a picture of Richard Branson, Sir Richard Branson, from his very comfortable private island in the Caribbean called Necker Island. That is part of the British Virgin Islands. That has, on top of the beauty of the scenery and the constant temperature over there, has another advantage, which is that it's tax-free. If you live there, you don't pay taxes. So Branson has lived there for the last 14 years and therefore has not paid a single cent in taxes to the British state in 14 years. Recently, from there, he launched an appeal to the British government to ask a tiny little amount, £500 million, to save his company Virgin from bankruptcy. Otherwise, jobs would be destroyed. He's a billionaire himself. So we see the example of what the system has derived into. We've got companies that are so big and people that make people very rich, companies that are so big that the states can't afford to let them go. That's what happened with the banks. That's probably what is going to happen with certain companies now. So the public state is saving the private sector to save the economy and to avoid social damages. Between 2009 and 2020, the bonuses in Wall Street in the banks that were saved by taxpayers' money have been indecent, have been huge. So the amount of money that has been privatized by people working in banks or owning shares in banks and so on, and that were saved before by taxpayers has been huge. So that's really the problem of privatization of profits, socialization of losses. We are creating on one side an excess, surplus of profit, and on the other side, a deficit. And it always goes in the same direction. Now, we could say, okay, we don't repay public debt, fine, well, let it grow. I mean, why don't we go with the liberal economists? You know, these guys seem to be reassuring, say it's fine, you know, the market is fine, so yeah, don't worry, that's okay. In fact, it can create two problems. The first one is taxes are still paid and could be raised to reduce slightly the debt. We're not even talking about repaying the debt. We are talking about reducing the speed at which it increases. So we're not even talking about repaying the debt. It's just slowing down the increase. And if we do that, we need to have more taxes. Taxes, if they are paid by the people, basically will make for them less cash available to spend, and it will lead to a sluggish economy. Less cash to spend is not good for businesses. The second solution, which has been adopted by many states in the past, is to reduce public spending. Because if you reduce the spending, you don't need to raise that many taxes. So you try and cut public spending. So you will cut on a number of things like hospitals, justice, all kinds of police, borders, watches, all of that, all these things. And I summarize it here as cutting on social welfare. If we do that, it will have an impact on the health and the confidence of the workers. And we see that confidence is important for consumer morale and consumer spending eventually. So by reducing public spending, eventually we are generating bad productivity, lower consumer spending, and a sluggish economy. So yes, debt is a problem for businesses, for people, but then eventually for businesses too. So it would be in the interest of companies and wealthy individuals to make sure public debts do not increase too much, even get repaid, but let's start by not increasing too much. Otherwise, they will be impacted too. So yeah, say again, you don't want to pay taxes. That's important. Paying taxes is necessary to reduce this debt so that it doesn't become a drag for the economy. Now, the imbalances are troublemaker. Let's take another example, which is Apple. Apple has approximately $200 billion locked in cash, locked behind the tax wall. They can't take that cash out, otherwise they would have to pay taxes, and that's something they would absolutely not do. So instead of paying taxes, they borrow money to pay dividends. I repeat, they borrow money to pay dividends. That's in financial orthodoxy, something that makes absolute no sense. And they do not even reinvest the cash because they don't know what to do with it, and they refuse to pay taxes to the government that maintains, in the meantime, all the public services that Apple is happy to enjoy. And so, on one side, we've got ballooning surplus for Apple, ballooning deficit for the US state. We could find many other examples of that. So the fantasy of Uncle Scrooge that you see here on the picture of swimming into piles of coins is not a funny ducktail anymore. It's become a real threat because someone's surplus is someone else's deficit. But wait a second, surpluses are reinvested. If I take the cash pile of Apple, it's mostly deposited at the bank, and the bank fund the public debt. Oh, fine. So directly or indirectly, Apple funds the public debt, so the surplus goes into the deficit and things are evened out. So we're okay. Are we? And we're not, because debt holders receive interest. To give you an example, in France, the taxes raised on private individuals, so the income tax of private individuals, is the same amount as the interest paid on the debt, not even repaying the debt, just the interest. So if my country didn't have debt anymore, I wouldn't have to pay taxes anymore. I could keep that money for myself and spend it, and then have the economy go better. So effectively, we increase by creating surplus and deficit and just mixing them that way. We create an increasing surplus and increasing deficit, and we have two problems. The power issue. The holders of public debt then have a say in how the states should manage their debt. And so they can demand certain things, and they can impose, for example, rather cutting public spending rather than increasing taxes. And it leads also to an efficiency issue, because we see that instead of cancelling the surplus and cancelling the debt, we continue in a system that increases both. So that's not a solution. Even if the surpluses are invested, that's not a solution. So here comes the Mars bad idea. Well, this man, who shall remain nameless for those of you who haven't recognized Elon Musk, is daydreaming about going to Mars and starting again, life on Mars, etc. That's not a song, that's a real thing. And his main reason behind it is that he thinks mankind is threatened by an quote-unquote inevitable extinction. Maybe they can't find enough safe havens, these wealthy people, to invest their money anymore. If you look at it, where can you invest money these days? Well, in public debt, and public debt starts smelling. So they started having this crazy idea of, okay, let's take our surpluses and take them to Mars. And we'll leave the deficits on Earth. That's the idea. I think it's a very bad idea. Effectively, when you get to a point where the 8 wealthiest people on Earth own as much as the poor half of the world population, which is 3.6 billion people, not million, billion people, there's something that's going wrong. If you take into account everything that we have described until now, the surpluses and the deficits, then it cannot work. So instead of considering getting their surpluses or their wealth back into circulation, some of these billionaires start, chasing the pipe dream of taking the surpluses to Mars and starting life again over there. The inevitable crisis, I think, if it has to come, is much more probable to be generated by these inequalities than any kind of other issues we can think of. So if we were to move to Mars, and if they were to move to Mars, that would be a complete failure for the economic system and, by extension, for mankind, I think. I'm not against going to Mars for the pleasure of it, if I may say so. It's in the human DNA to explore, so that's good. But saying we have to save mankind by moving to Mars, and by the way, we should take only the wealthiest so that we can have an easier situation to manage there, doesn't sound like a good idea. Here comes the case for circularity. We see that the problem is linearity in the flow of wealth. Okay? In good economic times, most of the money goes to the private sector, a bit goes to the public sector, not enough to repay the deficits. So there is cash piling up in the private sector and the hole here in the public sector. In bad times, well, there's a little bit of cash that still goes to the private sector, but there is cash coming from the public sector to the private sector. So the cash pile kind of increases and the hole increases as well. What should we do? Then we should get to work on this green arrow there, create the circularity, that some of the cash gets back to the public institutions in the good times so that the safety net can be recreated or the previous safety net can be reimbursed so that for the next crisis, then it's there again. And we are not digging a hole, but we are in fact coming back to a situation in which we're strong enough to face future trouble. So that's what we should work on. We should definitely work on trying to reinvest in a clever way these surpluses into the economy rather than daydreaming of putting them in the rocket and sending them to Mars. That's, I think, what should be done. So having said that, what can we expect from tomorrow's economy? The question was relaunch or rethink. Well, if we relaunch, we've just seen what was ahead of us. That's the picture on the top there. Doesn't sound very appealing. So rethink, of course. Let's rethink the economy. Let's rethink the economy. But then, you know, where shall we start? It seems to be huge. You know, it seems to be so problematic. Where shall we start? What about listening first? Circulate, having the wealth circulating in the economy sounds very much like circle. And there's one thing that has proven to be successful for millions of years, working in circles, it's nature. If you look at the food chain, only us humans could draw the food chain, as my picture on the top right, as a linear chain. We have seen the linear flow of wealth. We see the linear chain. So the carrots feed the rabbit, that feeds the fox, that feeds the lion, and the lion is on top. And we are even more on top of that. What we forget is that we get eaten by worms and the lions as well, and we get to feed the carrots indirectly again. So it's a circle. That's what we see at the bottom, and that's how nature works. Not how we see it works, but that's how it really works. Okay, so we have to think in circular terms and not in the accumulation of a profit or a surplus that would be taken to an elusive planet B. Our economy today is linear. If we look at how it works, first we extract things that are in limited supply, we move them, we transform these things, we use, and we throw away, we waste. At every step, oil is necessary in there, and we know that oil generates a lot of greenhouse gas that is damaging the planet. So unless we start eating waste, there will be a limit to this model. The linearity of taking stuff to transform eventually into waste cannot work. What are the solutions? What are the solutions for your generation, for you guys tomorrow who will actually work on that and will have to change the system? What can we do? First, you know, there are a number of ideas. I'm going to point out to a few things that I think are quite are creating enthusiasm in a way, and that could be very good possibilities to work on for the future. The first is the circular economy. Your output is your future input. If you look at these shoes on the right there, the white shoes, they are Adidas shoes produced by Adidas. They are 100% recyclable. So you can bring them to Adidas and they will reprocess them and reuse them, okay, and reproduce shoes. So there you've got circular economy because your output is your future input. And effectively, the value you add is in the design, in the research to make these shoes more efficient, etc. So there it can work. However, we'll have to use less energy. We see that a lot of oil is still burned for that. So we'll have to figure out a way to use less energy. For these ideas, let's get inspired by nature. There is a big thing that we should definitely study, which is biomimicry. One example, and that's just one among many great ones, it's growing light. You see on the right, that's a capture of a video by a company called Glowy. I give you the link there. And this company grows light. The tubes that you see on the building at the back are tubes that contain plankton, so these tiny little animals that live in the sea, and when you attack them, in a way, they grow, they generate light to defend themselves. You can do that, put that into the cities and light the cities that way. No oil involved in there, and you can recycle the plankton afterwards because it can get back into the food chain. So these are things that can be done, that have to be done in the future to make our economy circular and to make it clean. Another example, another possibility, I think, is social entrepreneurship. I think we are getting to the end of shareholder profit maximization. And I will tell you, as a teacher, I've been teaching shareholder profit maximization for years. Well, you know, when you invest, when you manage a company, when you do corporate finance, blah, 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 you have to go for shareholder profit maximization. I can't do that anymore. It's, we see what we've just seen. Shareholder profit maximization leads to imbalances, leads to risk, leads to economy fiction that we definitely do not want to test. So that can't be. We have to stop with that. So the aim of social entrepreneurship, yes, David?
Yeah, you were talking about shareholder profit maximization, but like every private company on the stocks, they're basically based on shareholder profit maximization because they all make dividends out of the fluctuation, whether off the market or depending on the consumption. So how do you completely, like the private sector, like simple things like, you know, Netflix or Apple and all, they have a huge share value, and Wall Street is basically based on that, because if they don't have a profit maximization, there wouldn't be any Wall Street. It would be non-existent. So how do you like kind of change this into a completely equal profit maximization or something of that type?
That's a very good point, and it's not going to be easy. Definitely, it's not going to be quick, and you know, capitalism, more or less as we know it, because it's going to change, but more or less as we know it, will probably continue. The thing is, we have to introduce a change, and we have to turn the economy into part of the solution to the problems we're facing, rather than leaving them as part of the problem that they create. So how do we change it? I'm going to confess you, I count on you guys. I count on your generation. My generation and above, I think my generation, we can still do things, but the inventivity, the drive, the energy is going to be yours. And I personally kind of pledge to do everything I can to help you and contribute as much as I can. But that's for your generation. I've heard a speech of you know, some kind of a graduation speech in an engineering company in France, and the guy who was talking said, you are the generation that has to do it. Previous generation could do it but didn't know. The next generation won't. It will be too late. They won't be able to do it. I think the same goes for business students. There will be a need for proper business and proper management in these new type of companies. And you will need to work hand in hand with those engineers to solve the problems. So we count on you. We count on you, and we definitely try and help you as much as we can by sharing the the little knowledge we might have on the way things work, on the experiences we might have done, but eventually changing all of that will be long, will not be simple, but I find it's going to be, I mean, I'm very enthusiastic about that, because at least we have the possibility to do and to invent. Whereas in the past, probably, we were told, you know, shareholder profit maximization and shut up or go away. And here we say, yeah, no, no. And so what else, which was your question, and let's invent the answer. Let's invent the answer altogether. So that's yeah, that's probably what we should do, I think. Back to social entrepreneurship, the end of shareholder profit maximization. You will see in point 3, it's not the disappearance, the complete disappearance of profit. It's generate a reasonable profit. And point 4, very important, reinvest it. Get back to the circularity. Invest it again. Don't lock it behind the walls of a bank and wait for it to earn what? Grow food or no, just reinvest it. So the aim is create jobs, care for the environment, generate reasonable profit, not excess profit, and reinvest it so that if what you do is successful, is good, then you will have a profit and then you can reinvest it. I'm telling you about 2 examples of social entrepreneurship, the you buy, I give model. So that's the picture on the right. That's a company that produces glasses. Every time a pair of, let's say, normal glasses or expensive glasses are bought in developed economies, 1 pair is given to a developing country for 1 person. So that's the you buy, I give model. So this one is kind of an interesting idea. The other one, and there are many others, but there is the Patagonia has done this too, and taxis. I haven't seen Javier. I'm sorry, I haven't seen your comment earlier about.
Yeah, I just meant that maybe the solution for this solution for the capitalism maybe be regulations, not taxes, but changing the regulations.
Sure, it's definitely there too. Yes.
But there, I see that maybe it's the economy itself the problem. So let me just try and explain it, because I see that all the countries are trying to compete in geopolitically, let's say, and then they are not able to say, okay, I sacrifice some of my benefits, so economical benefits, in order to get to social revenue, let's say, or social profitability. So then this competition is what is making us not being able to say, okay, let's change our values, because then Trump says, oh, China is that if I'm doing something, and China is going to grow more, and then they're going to be over me, or so on. And I don't know, this maybe it's just an opinion, but maybe COVID-19 is maybe changing a bit this point of cooperation and a more global view of everything, because at the end also COVID-19 is caused by ourselves and pushing the not the climate change, but the health of our world into the limits, let's say.
I do agree with your point. Indeed, very clear and makes much sense. Competition can be the whole economic system can be seen as having failed. I think we can say it now. It has failed, and that's what I was saying with Mars. You know, if you start saying we've, mind my French, but we fucked up so much that we need to move to another planet, then the system, we need to change the system. And if you find people to still defend the fact that it has to be done that way, we have counter arguments now. I remember one argument which was, we need to have very wealthy people and a lot of very wealthy people to show to entrepreneurs that they can do it and they can reach that level as well. Okay, but I'm an entrepreneur myself. I've never dreamt of having so much money that I could consider going to Mars. I want to work in my company, in a business I like, with people I like. And if I make a decent living from that, that's good, and the whole thing of always more, and eventually, well, take it away to another planet has to stop.
Ridiculous, yeah.
So we have to move, but there are certain theories around, competition becoming co-opetition. It's cooperation and competition at the same time, and whether we like it or not, the Earth is round and finite, and therefore we cannot consider mankind in different groups and so on. If we want to do something, we have to consider just beyond our own little person. So that's because if we do that, we are getting into the whole system that we have in place, the individualism, which is king and so on, and we get to this accumulation of surpluses and deficits. So we have to think globally and in groups, and we have to think of mankind as a whole, even in an egoistic way, because if we don't, we know it's going to create trouble for us. So even if I want to take care of myself, I have to take care of others. That's what I think the important part is. So yeah.
But I think that it's winning the if I want to care of myself, but I have to care of others, but then the other will be over me. So then I care more about myself and not about the whole. So it's kind of a mess. I don't know.
Oh yeah, true. There are many research theories and effectively material to manage collectivities. And that was a good sign, but a while ago, a Norwegian economist called Elinor Ostrom, you might have heard of her, got the Nobel Prize in Economy for managing what is called the commons. So when you have a common good, managing that, how do you do that? And I think one of the examples, was it hers or was it one I heard afterwards? I can't remember, but one of the examples was a river that came on top of a rice field. And there was only one source, which was the river, and that was going down into all the rice fields. And there is only one resource that had to be managed by the entire community. If the guys on top would take all the water, the ones at the bottom could not use it. And so they would fight the guys on top to get more water. And so they had to find a way to work together. And what she wrote, basically is used by many also associations and groups of people to manage common goods. And if we think about it, what is the biggest common good and the ultimate common good we have? It's Earth. You know, so we have to manage it. And whether we like it or not, whether we fear it or not, we have to build these type of cooperations. And instead of going down the direction of, I'm going to be better off on my own, which is the individualistic thing that we've been sold for years, like, if you want something, you should have it, or for the countries, let's say, okay, in Spain, we're Spanish, in France, we are French, in the US, we're US, we are Americans, and so on. That's I think, and that's only my personal opinion, but I think it's not the right direction. So
can you just repeat the name of the Nobel Prize, because I didn't get it?
Yeah, I'll put it.
Okay.
I'll put it here. Sorry.
That was really good answer. Thanks. Thanks.
So yeah. And yeah, so social entrepreneurship, we've got the model you buy, I give, or the other one, and there are others, and the one I'm showing you here is employ the unemployable. The picture of the three men here working in the fields are former prisoners, former convicts. When they get out of prison, they cannot be employed because people, don't want to employ people who come out of prison. So you've got companies that were created by employing these people. And here they have really, I think, they kind of maximize all the points that are listed above. They create jobs for people who would never find jobs, or in a very difficult way find jobs. They care for the environment because they do their agricultural practices are generally organic and etc. And they generate some profit because they sell their vegetables and fruits and so on, and they reinvest to continue. So these examples I find quite inspiring. Now, talking about agriculture, this one is a element or one sector that will need to be completely rethought and reorganized. Why? Because it has been approached linearly again. That the earth produces, I take, and then the rest I just put to waste. And if I can sell some chemicals to put in it, then that's okay. You see the guy on the bottom left, he's spraying something on strawberries apparently, that has to be so bad that he has to wear a mask, glasses, and gloves. I mean, do you want to eat those strawberries? I don't. So we can move. There are new ways to approach agriculture. There are new organic and viable ways to grow the food. And then to distribute it as well, instead of moving them across the world in big tankers, then why not consume locally? Why not think of these things? And I think there will be a need for good managers in that sector too. There will definitely be some work to be done in that sector that has been overlooked for decades as the peasants there. It's a bit smelly with all that. No, that's what we eat, and food, what we eat is what we are, to some extent. So it has to be resourced as well. And finally, banking. Banking has to change as well, because as we've seen, they finance the economy. And if they get to choose, and that's the case, the projects they finance, they can give an orientation that can be either very problematic, like exploiting tar sands, which are an ecological absolute catastrophe, or they can try and build, for example, green cities. There are a number of things in the lines of sustainable finance, impact investing, and things like that. There are a number of good new ventures in the financial sector that really try and go in the right direction. So that's that's also something that can change, and in which good qualified people should work and should go work and invest their energy. As conclusion, I would say, I really believe the future can be bright again on Earth, not on Mars, but it won't shine the way we thought it would. We will have to reinvent it. By nature, I'm an optimistic, because there's a quote I like: the optimistic and pessimistic are both wrong. The only thing is the optimistic lives better. I'm interested in living better, so I'm an optimistic. And even I would even go to say, as far as saying that I'm enthusiastic about this, because we have to make these changes. We have to invent them instead of reprocessing an existing or continuing an existing system. We've got to do it, and that's doable, definitely. The moving on Mars thing, because otherwise we would all collapse and so on. I don't even want to listen to that. We can do it, and we have to reinvent as much as mankind in a way, and that's a source of motivation and energy, I think. So thank you very much for your attention, for your participation, your questions, and if you have any question, happy to engage in the discussion with you.
Thank you very much, Damien. Has anyone got any questions at the end?
I had one.
Yeah.
I just wanted, maybe it's a bit off, but I want to know how the IMF is funding states or getting countries out of debt to an extent, because now I think about 100 countries have approached the IMF to help them out. And isn't this adding to the indebtedness that we already have?
From the IMF in the past, I don't know if they will change now, but in the past came in to rescue countries and imposed the liberal medicine, cutting costs, liberalizing the economy, deregulating, etc., so that the country would embark into the capitalist path and go there. So unless they kind of change the approach, I'm afraid these past solutions have proven generally to be more adding to the problem than to the solution. I mean, it's difficult to say because they still, got money into the country and the country is working, but eventually it didn't really solve it for the countries that got helped by the IMF. So I would be tempted to be a bit cautious about that.
Okay, thank you.
So I also have another question. In the last slides, like I had the feeling that so you were talking about the solutions, right? And you were talking about agriculture. You were talking about social business. You were talking about banking. Maybe I would also have added mobility as a big thing, right? Inside businesses. But for me, and also again talking about COVID, we see that maybe what more value has is a bit kind of an anti-globalization. So we have to go backwards. So we have to consume local. We have to move less. We have to travel less. We have to spend the money in our own countries. So do you think this, I don't know, backwards globalization is something real, or maybe e-commerce? So I don't know what's the question, but I think you can sort it out.
I think the beginning is, are we going backwards? And I'm not so sure that consuming local is really going backwards in a way. I would be tempted to see the changes we have to do as positive changes, not going backwards. In fact, I would be tempted to see that take what we've done well in the past and use that, and leave the crap. Leave the crap on the side. Take what was good in the past. Consuming local food that has been produced locally makes more sense than consuming strawberries in the winter that come from all the other side of the world. I'll consume other fruits in the winter. Fine, no worries. So transportation and travel. There will be a big part on transportation for sure, but maybe we could also travel a bit less far and a bit differently. Instead of running through cities and seeing nothing, then taking a bit more time when we go somewhere. I don't think we tend to see it, and it's clear, and we hear that in the news and so on. How we will go back to the Middle Age and we'll have to grow our own potatoes and so on. Well, I'm growing potatoes and I like it. It's really nice, but it's and I don't feel like I'm being back into the Middle Age and being a heavy peasant or something. It's we have the what we're doing right now. We are talking. You're in Spain. I'm in France. Maybe some of you are even elsewhere, and we're having this discussion there. This will stay. This will stay, and even if we eat food that has been produced locally, this we will have. Even if we travel a bit less far, this we will have. So we're not going backwards. I think some of the things that we have to do look like it, but in fact have to be rethought and reprocessed so that we can move forward. Talking about culture,
sure.
I'm just finishing on the agriculture. I let you speak afterwards. We're not going backwards by producing locally, because the amount of knowledge we have, the biological knowledge, doubles every 5 years. So we are not going as the peasants in the past that were just, putting seeds in the ground and hoping for the best. We know many more things. We can analyze the soils. We can analyze the phytosociology, it's called, so the way the plants work together so that they can be more resistant for climate change or anything else. So we in a way, there is only a tiny little fraction of going backwards, which is, okay, producing locally instead of worldwide. But we do that with all the knowledge we have accumulated since then. So, yeah.
But then maybe the question is why we went global in the first place. So it was an error, or are we going? If we go backwards, then we will go again. I don't know which is the right direction, but.
That's the story of the pendulum. We go
it's a bit
in one direction and then it goes back and then back again and it swings. I think the system proves that it doesn't work anymore. So we are going to build a new one, and this new one will fail eventually as well, and we'll have to build a new one. That's part of the thing. So in, let's say, the past system, globalization was obvious. In the new system, we've got a major constraint, which is climate and resources. and therefore we have to invent something around that. So I don't know if globalization was a mistake at the beginning. There were positive things. Certain countries really, and you know, big amount of people now in the middle class benefited from it. But it had side effects as well. And now in the pendulum, the side effects or the negative effects tend to be bigger than the positive ones. So I think we can say it was a mistake and now we need to change it completely. We are always in a gray area. It was kind of good at the beginning and it turned to be less good than, more bad than good, if I may say so. And now then we have to go in a different direction.
That makes sense. As soon as we don't destroy the pendulum, we can or we have to move the pendulum to Mars or something. I don't know. I don't know what's the analogy, but I think
I would be interested to see Elon Musk with a pendulum on Mars. It would be funny.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm not sure if there's more time or not. I have another question, but maybe it's too much.
We've come to the end of the 90-minute session.
No problem.
But I'm sure, for example, you could connect with Damien on LinkedIn, and if you have any questions, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer them. Does anyone else have a last question before we close the session?
Can I ask?
It's Tansu. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. But I have a question. It's a bit it's about oil and exchange rate. And the thing is, as you remember, on 8th of March, I think, in the result of the Saudi Arabian-Russia war, our exchange rate went like this. Yeah, and we overcame really big rates for dollar and euro. For example, I'm from the Russian part, I'm from Kyrgyzstan, but we're fixed to Russia and everything. So we experienced a really tough time there, but it went a bit stable after that. And then we came to the date when US oil crashed, it went to negative. And that moment, I don't know why we were all waiting for something to happen, again, but it didn't happen, or it didn't happen yet. And I wanted to ask, what do you think? Did it not happen yet, with the currency, or something happened so we didn't went that bad?
That's a good point. Good question. I'm a bit balanced or a bit torn between let's say the difference between tactics and strategy. Strategy is long-term, tactics is short-term. Was it a tactical problem, or was it a big strategic meeting point that was missed? Difficult to say. I would more lean towards the tactical thing. So the short-term kind of thing that a gathering of events in a random way produced that situation. I don't think the oil is going to go is going to go negative and collapse completely in the near future. We'll still drive cars and run plants or electric plants with oil and stuff like that. So it will still go up. But the fluctuations in exchange rate, that I'm afraid, from what we've seen on the central banks and the strength of the currencies backed by assets we don't really know of, might have an impact on the fluctuation of the exchange rates. Yes.
Okay. Well, I think everyone will virtually join me in saying a huge thank you to Damien. It was really insightful, and I think we've all learned a lot today. But also nice to kind of hear some of the sort of opportunities and the positive ways that we can make a change, and particularly the generation of most of our students. So thank you very much. I personally, despite hearing some of the kind of harsh realities, found it quite inspiring, and I'm sure most students share in that. So thanks again, Damien, and I hope you enjoyed it as well.
My great pleasure.
Okay.
It was a pleasure for me as well, and enjoyed the discussion and the questions and so on. And Yeah, that's, oh, I see a whole lot of messages.
Yeah, they're asking about the recording for the session. So guys, just to let you know, we have live streamed this to YouTube and it's being recorded. So it's going to be available via the ESEI YouTube channel. So I'm going to share the link with the whole ESEI community afterwards, so people can also join on, can catch up and watch the recording who couldn't make it today. So don't worry, guys, you'll have the recording.